So the first part of our discussion dealt with the situation of boycott coming out of a threatened boycott proposed by some sectors of the Jamaican trading bloc. Jamaican business is what I want to say. And we have dealt with that, and I thank my guests for that. We have to come into Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago, we've got some circumstances here, I tell you, that would cause you to raise your eyes every time. We're talking about that place called the Streets of the World. You haven't heard about it, have you? Well, it's a project that will consist of 22 acres of ultimate destination appealing to the entire Caribbean. Officials of Disney and Hetema Group, they specialize in unique creative designs for theme parks, museum, and cultural attractions, have already visited Trinidad and Tobago, held extensive discussions with Mr. Chen. Mr. Chen, you may know, is the owner of Movie Town and many other business interests. He has expressed his continued desire to continue the projects. Many either dismissed or forgot about the project, but owing to the magnitude, the land use, the environmental impact, tourist potential, and the procurement process, among others, the former president of the Joint Consultative Council has said, I am watching this with a hawk's eye, and it will not just run through me, run through Trinidad and Tobago, unless we have something to say about it. He is Afra Raymond. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us.
Thank you, Rennie, and good morning to the listeners.
It is always good to have you here. This situation we are looking at has disturbed you for a long time. Many folks are saying, listen, it's a big project. I mean, it's coming in here. There's a possibility this could be good for Trinidad and Tobago. Let me ask you firstly, is this a good deal, the idea of using Invaders Bay? Is it a good deal for Trinidad and Tobago? And just before you answer that, give our listeners a road map as to the area that we are talking about that will comprise Invaders Bay, and then answer the question, is it good for Trinidad and Tobago?
Well, the Invaders Bay lands, for those of you who aren't familiar, the Invaders Bay lands comprise about 70 acres of land that is south of Movie Town and the Marriott Hotel down at the south end of Port of Spain. It's waterfront land, it's virtually flat land, it is fairly well served in terms of connections to the utilities like roads and water and lights. And in development terms, it's prime and it's ripe for development. The big question you're asking, Rennie, so that's where it is. The big question you're asking, Rennie, is whether the proposed development will be good for the country. And that is where we need to pause for a cause, because in fact we don't know what is the proposed development. We've all heard about the Streets of the World. I think some of us have been to Movie Town and seen Mr. Chin has a rather ambitious computer-generated image kind of show about what the Streets of the World would represent and so on. And there's another project nearby, let us get into this, which is called the Invaders Bay Marina, that was also approved by the People's Partnership. So the extension to Movie Town that we're calling Streets of the World was approved, and also the Invaders Bay Marina project was approved. The Streets of the World is about 10.3 acres. The Invaders Bay Marina is about 13.5 acres. So in fact, a bigger piece of land was approved. And in fact, in the mix, we don't actually understand, at least I don't understand, as somebody who studied it closely, what is being proposed. How tall are the buildings? We don't know. How many square feet? We don't know. How many square feet of offices? How many square feet of shops? How many square feet of restaurants? What is the feasibility of that for the country? How many berths in terms of our marina and so on? Those are fundamental questions that we don't know the answer to.
And that is
so
why
the question
it's so
you're
important.
asking me, Rennie, which is a natural question, whether the project will be good for the country, we're unable to answer because we don't know enough about the project, which brings us to the point where we could possibly go next in the discussion, the question of consultation and the involvement of the wider society in these large-scale developments.
And just before we do that, the gentleman said that I am in ignorance as to exactly the scope and the details of this. He's a chartered surveyor. He was the president of the Joint Consultative Council. So if he is in limbo as far as clarity on this, well, here is my question before we get to that. Because part of the major objection you had on this was the procurement policy. Yes. You said early that the Central Tenders Board regulations were violated in the way in which this was in fact handed over. Delineate for me, please.
Well, our submission at the time, and that submission was made on the 14th of December 2011, our submission at the time to the then Minister of Planning was Minister Boyendrat Tiwari. We submitted that the Central Tenders Board Act was being violated because in fact we didn't have a special committee set up because the ministerial limits on tendering, a ministry can only tender up to a very low amount. I think the amount is $2 million before they have to go through the Central Tenders Board. This ministry, that is the Ministry of Planning and Sustainable Development, tendered the mega Invaders Bay project without using the Central Tenders Board. So that was the first breach. The second breach was that, in fact, the Central Tenders Board Act and some of its supplementary amendments in 1997 give the Central Tenders Board the right to act for the state where, in fact, property is being leased. And property was being leased at Invaders Bay because the actual structure of the deal is that the 10.3 acres that Movietown Streets of the World was to get and the 13.5 acres that the Invaders Bay Marina were to get were to be leased to those people. So on those two counts alone, the thing should have proceeded under the Central Tenders Board Act. And to have proceeded through the ministry, it was a breach of the Central Tenders Board Act. The then government, that was the People's Partnership with Dr. Tiwari as the minister, then the government got legal advice and went to Parliament and said that they had legal advice that said that what they were doing was correct and proper and conformed to the Central Tenders Board Act. We, that is the JCC, which I was president of at that time, we challenged that legally. And we said under the Freedom of Information Act, okay, you have legal advice that what you're doing is correct and proper and conforms to the law. Publish the advice, give it to us, and they wouldn't do it. And that is how we started the serious fight that got us into a court battle, which we won on the 14th of July 2014. And it was a very historic battle, and the High Court actually ordered the government to publish the information. They, of course, appealed, and we've gone through the appeal procedure, and we are now waiting, all sides are waiting for the judgment to be delivered. It's what's called a reserved judgment. All the arguments and submissions have been completed. But it's a very important point. Can a political administration obtain legal advice on a public project? That legal advice is obtained at public expense.
And the public should
they
see
can
it,
claim
yes.
in public that the advice supports what they're doing, but they can suppress the advice. And that is something that we regard as unacceptable. I am no longer a JCC. I continue to regard it as unacceptable. And it begs the question, what could have been so damaging about publishing legal opinions that supported you? And it begs the question whether what is taking place there was improper. I maintain the view that it was improper, an improper series of things. But what's interesting, Rennie, is that what Minister Imbut spoke about, because we're dealing with a new political scenario here, a new political administration after the election on 7th of September, what Minister Imbut spoke about was a different thing from what the JCC have been protesting about, the 10.3 acres and the 13.5 acres, and perhaps that kind of nuance, we could get into that, you know?
No, we will. I'm just holding back here to understand. When you say you were devoid of details, I understand the procurement. I understand the fact that it should have gone through the process. It did not because they sidestepped it because it exceeded the amount they were supposed to give. What I'm lost to is there had to be a feasibility study that dealt with the environmental impact of such a project, the marine impact of such a study. Were you ever privy to that? Were we ever privy to that?
Well, our research, I conducted a certain amount of research, Rennie. That's an important question you ask, because Invaders Bay is one of the last surviving areas. You could call it secondary mangrove because it was cleared of vegetation at a particular time in mid 2014. It was cleared of vegetation, but that vegetation quickly regrows. Invaders Bay is one of the last mangrove sites bounding the city. The mangrove has an environmental role, not only in terms of a habitat for certain types of creatures and so on, but also as a buffering mechanism in terms of flooding and the drainage of the city. So important questions are raised by the development of those coastal lands. Our research indicated, and I did carry out research directly with the records of the EMA when I held that office at JCC, our records indicated that applications had not been made for the environmental impact assessment and the CEC. They may have been made subsequently, but applications were not made. And in fact, this is one of the things you see with dancing with a kind of a paradox here. On the one hand, we have a development, and this spans across political administrations. We have a development that we are told is good for us. So these lands are not being used. We're going to take lands that are not being used, and that development will be good for the society.
Oh,
that is a political rubric.
Yeah, because that's almost comical. I mean, you have trees that are not being used seemingly, yet they're holding the land together.
Exactly, but I'm just saying that's the dialogue. The second point is that the development is proceeding, and you're given the development details in the vaguest possible way. So, in fact, we are told about the streets of the world. We are told about the marina. Mr. Imbert spoke about some things. I'll get into Mr. Imbert's statement in a little while. We then realize that nothing's been approved because nothing's been applied for. And if nothing's been applied for, nothing could have been approved. Just to go through the paradox. If nothing's been approved, then what has the state agreed to? And how could the state agree to something if in fact it wasn't approved? So to take an example of, because we have A, Mr. Streets of the World, we have B, Mr. Marina, and we have C, the project that Mr. Imbert is talking about. If in the case of one of those projects, what was agreed to by the state were terms that were appropriate at 20-story building, just as an example, a simple example for listeners. What happens if the approval authorities come back and say that, in fact, you can only build 12 stories? Or that, in fact, you can't go any higher than 5 stories? What happens to the agreement? So, in fact, are we witness to a situation in which our approval agencies are being set up, to use local parlance, by a prior agreement from politicians? And this takes us to an important point, that this scale of development, Rennie, should not take place, and listeners, should not take place without proper consultation. We need to understand what's happening. That land is our land, and the lease of that land represents a public investment. Even though the government may not spend $1 of public money in the literal sense, they may not spend any money and give a contract, it represents an investment of public assets, because the land is a public asset, and therefore we need to be aware of what's happening on our land, why is it happening, and in other words, the costs and the benefits of it, which would include, of course, the environmental aspects that you started this discussion on, Rennie.
We're talking about Invaders Base. 15 minutes after 11 o'clock, you inside Brunch. The voice you're hearing is that of Afra Raymond, who is a Chartered Surveyor and former president of the Joint Consultative Council. And we are looking at statements made from the Trade and Industry Minister, but a statement that she's going to meet with him. However, she was careful to detail that some of the objections that the party had during the elections, these must be met. You speak of new statements made by Mr. Imbert, and you said you would detail that. Please do that.
Sure. Well, what I was speaking to, let me give those details now, Rennie. Thank you. What I was speaking to is that Minister Imbert gave a 2016 mid-year review of the budget at Parliament on Friday the 8th of April this year, which is 2 Fridays ago, Friday before last. And that statement is contained at the Ministry of Finance website. And at the bottom of page 30, I can read for you what Minister Imbert said as it relates to Invaders Bay. And the minister said that in October he had mentioned that our diversification strategy would center around international financial services, tourism, and some related maritime activities. We have now begun discussions with some foreign investors on a set of integrated projects comprising an expanded international financial center, a 5-star hotel, and a convention center located in Invaders Bay. There's a bit here where he talks about a maritime issue that I don't want to go into, and then I'm going to skip to the next paragraph where the minister says, the International Financial Center could include one or more Chinese banks as anchor tenants, dedicated to servicing China's considerable lending programs in Latin America and the Caribbean. The presence of these Chinese institutions should also serve as a strong attraction for other international banks to the International Financial Center. The existing Trinidad and Tobago International Financial Center will continue to focus on back office operations, business processes, outsourcing, and capital market activity. What that is telling me, in so many words, is that there is a proposal here that the current administration has begun discussions on with an international financial center, a 5-star hotel, and a convention center at Invaders Bay. And that center certainly seems, from the minister's language, to have a significant involvement of Chinese financial institutions, which to me is telling me that the Chinese financial institutions would probably play a leading role in the whole development, and that actually opens the door for another way that the procurement process
can be bypassed.
Could be sidestepped, and we have to be alert to that, because we have to be alert and mindful to our national interests.